William Dalrymple, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having me.
Now, amongst your many projects, you've just completed an 11-part history of Gaza. What does the history of Gaza tell us that we should know when contemplating, thinking about what happens next there?
Well, everything is the short answer. And the first interesting thing we found was that no one had done this before, although it's been on, obviously, the front page of every newspaper and the top of every news bulletin for nearly 2 years now.
And indeed, obviously, for decades.
Yeah, and for decades before that, stretching back 75 years. There had never been a television or radio or podcast history of Gaza, a real deep dive. And of course, what it shows is the old Golda Meir line that the Palestinians never existed or do not exist is nonsense. In fact, if you look at the history of Gaza, the first reference to Palestinians is in 1483 BC, and Tutmosis III, the pharaoh, who talks about the Peliset invading Egypt. You get the Syrians talking about them 800 AD, where they're Palashtu, and by the time of Herodotus, the father of history, the Greek historian, the southern coast of the eastern Mediterranean, he calls Syria Palestina, and that's where we get our word Palestine from. And so you have, extraordinary, one of the very oldest peoples of the world. And they have this rich history. Gaza, not just the Palestinians, but Gaza itself is this incredibly rich port. Alexander, when he gets there, Alexander the Great, conquers it. And interestingly, it's the first reference you have to tunnels in Gaza, is Alexander the Great digging under the walls because the soil is so soft.
So as an historian, do you draw, therefore, a direct line for you between this long, rich history of this people, a named people, and the desire for and the world contemplation now of a Palestinian state?
So the first really important thing is that, yes, there is a direct line, which is proven by DNA between this mix. I mean, that coast, like every other coast of the Mediterranean, has seen people come through it. You have migrations, and it's a mixed, multicultural, multilinguistic, multi-ethnic, multi-religious area all through its history. And there is continuities. The line that Netanyahu's been using lately is that the Arabs arrived in the 7th century. Well, it's true that about a small elite arrived in the 7th century as a military government, just like the Normans arrived in England. It didn't mean that the Normans wiped out everybody that was in England before the Norman conquest. Yes, I mean, this place has been, like everywhere else, homes to many people, and there are now two groups that identify as indigenous, and they both need to have space.
Now, let me move on to one of the other topics that you're going to be talking about on your tour in Australia, which is one of your recent works, entitled The Golden Road, but
Correct.
The subtitle is How Ancient India Transformed the World, which proposes at its heart a rethink of the development of civilization. How did India's role in that development get missed out? How come it's still missing from our sense of how civilization
It's
evolved?
a fascinating question because, obviously in the West we're brought up with Romans and Greeks, and you and I learned it probably at nursery school about, Archimedes jumping out of the bath shouting Eureka. But we never heard about Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta, who are in fact the people that came up with the numbers we actually use every day. The numbers that we in the West call Arabic numbers. But the Arabs know that they got them from India, and they call them Hindu numbers. So if you go to Egypt or to Syria, they call them Hindi or Hindu numbers.
Right. So it's not. But it's not just a question of perspective. There's much more missing from our idea of India's role in that period.
I think it's very interesting why this is the case, and obviously colonialism is part of the answer. You can't colonize a country and say you're bringing civilization if you admit that there's 4,000 years of rich, deep civilization while you guys were running around in bearskins, So India has, I think, been left out of this somehow. China has been very good at telling its story. And this idea of the Silk Road is a very neat shorthand, just two words that does all the work,
yes,
linking Europe with China, and gunpowder and printing and the book and paper and all this sort of thing. But somehow India's contributions have been left out. And they are, most importantly, the spread of Buddhism over the whole of Asia, and with that Sanskrit and Prakrit and all these philosophies. Hinduism, which took over Southeast Asia and transformed it, epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are now absolutely integral to that region as well as India. But for the world as a whole, India's gift is mathematics and the numbers we use every day. If we're looking at this on a laptop or a mobile phone, those numbers that you have on your screen, below your screen, were invented in India in the 1st century.
And what about in India? So if we're going to rediscover India's role in various elements in the spread of civilization, of course, not just maths, but astronomy and all maths-related topics, and art and literature, dance, do Indians understand their role in this broad history?
Well, this book has been a #1 bestseller in India for a year because I think a lot of them didn't, because, you know, colonial education syllabuses kind of left them out. And many schools in India still teach all about Henry VIII's 6 wives and leave out this whole chunk of important Indian history. That is changing now, of course, and it's been changing for 70 years.
And what about in the contemporary political world of India? Is it also something that's very useful to Narendra Modi?
Yes, it is, but I have tried very hard to make it a politically neutral study. One of the ways of doing this is to emphasise what is hugely important, which is the role of Buddhism, which does not come under the purview of the present nationalist government so much, which is vast. Buddhism reached out. I mean, it's extraordinary when you see the map from a period of about 200 BC, at the time of the Emperor Ashoka, to about 400 AD, a period of about 400 years. Buddhism spreads as far as Siberia, Mongolia, through Tibet, up through Afghanistan and Pakistan, down to Sri Lanka, the whole of Southeast Asia. And with it, it brings not just the philosophy of the Buddhism and how to avoid suffering, but also the whole of Indian literature, geography, conceptions of time, cosmology, astronomy. And it covers the whole of Asia, and that influence remains today. When you go to Japan, you see Buddhist monks. When you go to Sri Lanka, you see stupas and Buddhist monks. When you go to Thailand, you know, this is not something that has retreated. And the most extraordinary thing is that uniquely in world civilization, this was done without an arrow being shot, a sword being drawn, or a spear being thrown. It's soft power in its sort of purest form.
At its most supreme form. Let me ask you a personal question, because like many people of your generation, you have personal connections to many of these stories, many of them dark, including the East India Company, including the Raj, and still to come, I think, the very dark story of the Opium Wars. How does that change the way you think about the history that you do, that your own ancestors were involved?
It makes it more interesting and more personal. I mean, I found, in a sense, ancestors on every side of this conflict, as well as the Scots one. I have Bengali Hindu ancestors, I had Mughal ancestors, all of which have been written out of the family story, of course. But my generation of Brits have grown up with the idea that their ancestors were not necessarily the good guys, and in most of the world were not. As soon as you break out of, in a sense, your nationalist chrysalis that you're brought up with all the patriotic myths that every nation has, and begin to look at world history. Of course, the Brits have been involved in atrocities everywhere, but also, you know, importantly, have done more, for better or worse, to change the world as we know it than any other nation. And so, as long as you are able, as far as possible, to shed that patriotic nationalist carapace, it gives you an immediate personal access to a lot of world history, and is a good starting point for learning what happened before.
William Dalrymple, for all that you have given us, and especially in the moment, this great rethinking of India. We have a massive Indian diaspora here. They'll be fascinated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.